Is it possible that this 14-foot-long linen cloth captured the greatest paranormal event of all time?
There's a sense of urgency about moving Jesus' body from the execution site to the burial site.
In 2015, scientists decoded DNA from the Turin Shroud, and what they found shouldn't exist. Not one person, not one region, but genetic traces from China, India, East Africa, and the Middle East.
The shroud is believed to be a holy relic because you don't get much more holy than the actual blood of Jesus.
All embedded into a single ancient cloth. This wasn't contamination, it was a map.
According to the legends, the shroud is the cloth that his body is wrapped in. And because of the contact with the body of Jesus, that transforms and leaves a lasting mark on the cloth.
A 2,000-year journey written in microscopic detail, too precise to fake, too complex to explain. And when researchers saw the full pattern, even skeptics went silent. Because if this cloth is real, it changes everything we think we know about history.
The Shroud of Turin is this amazing relic. At bottom, it's a piece of cloth. It shows a very faint sort of image of a crucified man. And the crucified man calls us to remember Jesus' death and resurrection.
The first crack, a photograph before cameras. May 28, 1898, Turin, Italy. A man named Secondo Pia takes the first photograph of the shroud. At the time, it looked like nothing more than a faint, unclear stain, a relic surrounded by belief, but offering no clear answers. But photography back then wasn't simple. It was slow, technical, unforgiving, glass plates, long exposure times, harsh lighting. Pia had to climb scaffolding inside the cathedral hauling equipment that weighed as much as a suitcase. He used magnesium flashes to illuminate the darkness. 2 large plates, carefully exposed. Then he waited. Hours later, alone in his darkroom, he begins the process. The chemicals react. The image slowly forms. And then, his hands start shaking, because what he was about to see would force scientists to ask a question no one had ever asked before. Not what is this, but how was this even possible? Because what appears on the plate shouldn't be possible. Staring back at him is a face, clear, human, detailed, not a blur, not a stain. A man, closed eyes, a broken nose, a mustache and beard, bruising across the face. For the first time in history, the figure on the cloth is no longer abstract. It looks alive. Not just alive, recognizable. As if this wasn't an image being created, but a moment being captured. But here's what stops everything. This isn't the photograph, it's the negative. Which means the cloth itself already contains a perfect photographic negative, created centuries before photography was invented. Think about that. No one in the Middle Ages understood how negatives worked. No one could test an image they couldn't see. Even today, artists rely on feedback, iteration, correction. But this would require perfect execution on the first attempt. No mistakes, no previews. Impossible. And here's where it gets disturbing. Because this means the image was created in a way no one at the time could even understand, let alone reproduce. And yet, the image works flawlessly. Light and shadow behave exactly like a real photograph. Depth and detail are preserved with precision. This isn't how paint behaves. It's not how ink behaves. It behaves like light, captured in a single instant. And yet, every test that should expose it keeps confirming it instead. That moment changed everything. But it also created a problem no one could solve, because the more they tested it, the less sense it made. Because from that point on, the shroud could no longer be dismissed as simple art. It demanded explanation, and every attempt to explain it only made the mystery deeper. If this is already raising questions in your mind, subscribe now, because what comes next is where science itself starts to struggle. The DNA map, a journey no one could fake. For more than 6 centuries, the argument never moved. Believers saw it as sacred. Skeptics saw it as deception. Both sides were certain. Neither side could prove it. Until science stepped in. In 2015, researchers approached the shroud differently. Not as a relic, not as a symbol, but as a crime scene. Every fiber treated as evidence. Every particle as a clue. Using sterile micro-vacuum tools, they extracted microscopic dust trapped deep within the threads, spaces untouched by time, sealed from the outside world. Inside that dust was DNA, not just any DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, the kind that survives for thousands of years and traces human origins with precision. For weeks, machines ran continuously. Millions of genetic sequences decoded, compared against global databases. Then the results appeared. And this is the moment everything should have fallen apart. Because if the shroud was fake, this data would expose it instantly. And the room went quiet. Because what they expected was one dominant signal. What they found was the entire world, which should not happen. Not on a single object. Not across this many continents. And that's where the real problem begins. Because this result doesn't support belief, and it doesn't support skepticism either. Middle Eastern DNA tied to ancient populations, European DNA from centuries of contact, African markers pointing to Egypt and Ethiopia, South Asian sequences from India, East Asian signatures linked to China, all on one piece of cloth. This wasn't random noise, it was structured, consistent, geographically meaningful. When mapped, the DNA followed a specific path: Jerusalem, Edessa, Constantinople, Europe. An ancient route once thought to be legend. The Silk Road. At each location, the cloth wasn't hidden. It was displayed. People gathered. They came close. They touched it. They kissed it. And every interaction left something behind. Skin cells, hair fragments, microscopic traces invisible to the human eye. Over centuries, those traces accumulated, layer upon layer, not randomly, but in sequence. A biological timeline written across 2,000 years. And here's the part no one expected. The timeline doesn't break. It connects perfectly, which raises a much bigger question. Because if this path is real, then the origin can't be medieval. Now think about what that means. For this to be a forgery, a medieval craftsman would need access to genetic material from multiple continents. China, India, Africa, the Middle East. At a time when global travel barely existed, he would need to place that DNA invisibly into the fabric, in patterns that only modern genetic analysis could detect. And he would need to do it perfectly, so that centuries later it forms a coherent geographic map. That's not just unlikely, that's impossible. This wasn't manufactured, it was lived, and somehow recorded. The cloth didn't originate in one place, it moved, and every place it touched left something behind that we can still detect today, and it carried the memory of every place it touched. The point of no return, blood, time, and the impossible image. The DNA was only part of the story, because something else was embedded in the fibers, something even harder to explain. Pollen. Scientists identified dozens of plant species trapped in the cloth, some from Europe expected after centuries of exposure, but many came from the Middle East, and some from an extremely narrow region between Jerusalem and Jericho. Plants that don't grow anywhere else on Earth. One species stood out, a thorny desert plant. Its pollen was concentrated heavily around the head area. Why would thorn pollen be localized like that? There's only one explanation that fits. A crown of thorns, not symbolically, physically. And this is where coincidence stops making sense. Then came the blood. For years, skeptics argued it was paint, pigment. But advanced testing proved otherwise. It's real human blood, type AB, which means whatever created this image wasn't symbolic. And inside that blood was something disturbing. Chemical markers of extreme trauma, levels of stress compounds that only appear under catastrophic conditions, prolonged torture, severe dehydration, massive muscle damage, the kind of trauma associated with Roman crucifixion, more than 100 wounds, consistent with scourging. This wasn't symbolic, it was biological evidence of suffering, the kind you don't recreate. unless it actually happened. Even the color of the blood, still red after centuries, was explained by elevated bilirubin levels caused by extreme stress. Then came the test that was supposed to end everything. Carbon dating. 3 laboratories. 1 conclusion. Medieval. Forgery. Case closed. That should have ended the mystery. Instead, it restarted it. And this time, the questions got harder. Except, this is where the entire conclusion collapses. Because decades later, scientists discovered a critical flaw. The sample came from the edge of the cloth, a section that had been repaired in the Middle Ages, rewoven with newer threads. They didn't date the original fabric. They dated the repair. When a newer method analyzed the linen itself at a molecular level, the result pointed somewhere else entirely. The 1st century. The time of Christ. Which means one of the 2 things must be wrong. The test, or everything we thought we knew. Which brings us to the one question no one has been able to answer. And the closer scientists get to answering it, the more impossible it becomes. And then, the final mystery. The image. No paint. No ink. No brushstrokes. It exists only on the outermost surface of the fibers, thinner than a human hair. It's not applied. It's a chemical change, as if the cloth was briefly exposed to an intense burst of energy. Scientists tried to recreate it. Heat failed. Chemicals failed. Radiation failed. Nothing worked, not even close. Except one thing, a short, high-intensity burst of ultraviolet radiation, technology that didn't exist in the ancient world, and even that couldn't fully replicate it. Then came NASA's analysis. The image contains accurate 3-dimensional data. The intensity of the imprint corresponds to the distance between the body and the cloth. No artist has ever achieved that, not even with modern tools, because everything you've just seen leads to a single point, and it's the one detail modern science still cannot recreate. Not partially, not approximately, at all. So now everything comes down to this. If all of this evidence points to the same moment, then what actually happened inside that tomb? Was it something science hasn't caught up to yet, or something it never will? I want your honest answer, not what you've heard, what you actually think. And if you're still thinking about this, subscribe, because the next one goes even deeper.